in India, child marriage, child widows, because if you have child marriage and the man dies, then that child is a widow. You can't marry again for her life. That kind of social evil. Parda, polygamy, concubinage, and in China, foot binding, whereby they thought small feet were more beautiful, and young women had their feet bound to prevent them growing big. And that became also a bit of a issue, that those sort of practices should be abolished. So the issue came, the nationalists joined in saying, look, we have to reform. We have to do away with some of these things. We have to modernize. We have to educate our girls, make them into doctors and lawyers and so forth. And that gave an impetus to feminism in the third world countries. Now, the link between nationalism, there are two social movements. Nationalism on the one hand, where you want to clean up your act in a sense and abolish some of these practices, nationalism, and feminism, where you want to establish the rights of women. And this book, several people have pointed out, establishes the link. They are not two separate things in the book. In this book, the feminist struggles more or less arose out of the impetus and support they got from nationalists. There was no big movement against right of women to vote, although there were some conservative individuals like Sapurnamalam Ramanathan, who famously said giving women the vote is casting pearls before swine. But in spite of certain individuals like that were totally diehard and reactionary, generally there was support from the more enlightened male sections of the population.
But even they I think, argue or point out that for most or some of these nationalists, major nationalists and nationalist movements, there was a certain conservative bias, and that modernity for them meant that women should be educated, but educated to sort of uphold the patriarchal family.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah, in a lot of these countries, you didn't oppose education because you think it would improve the women in your family who were not socially, in a sense, backward. But you could make them into good wives and mothers. That the children would benefit, or the husband would benefit. Here, this is my wife, and she speaks the foreign language, and all the rest of it. And that educating women was not a dangerous proposition, that patriarchy would be reinforced. So there was always that bias, but nevertheless, even though there could have been a bias, the movement to educate and to bring women out of the home into the public sphere continued. Education earlier had been confined to the elite, bourgeois elite, and it had been religious mainly, religious education. The colonial government opened up schools. Their policy was schools are a progressive thing, and colonial policy is not objecting. In fact, they encouraged, and then they were superseded by missionaries who came in, who said, we want to convert these people. So we give them a good education, but we convert them in the meantime. But of course, it doesn't work like that. You take the education and leave the religion behind. But what happened was then, the Christians wanted to produce good Christian wives and mothers. The bourgeoisie wanted good wives and mothers, not necessarily conversion, but in the sense of obedient and following the patriarchal laws and so forth. So there are many factors then that were operating in giving some space to women.
Dr. Kumari, to focus a bit on your other book, Casting Pearls, you talk about this long history to the emergence of consciousness of women's rights in Ceylon. Going back to the 1840s, as you mentioned earlier. Could you just explain how this movement started and perhaps drawing examples from other movements also?
Yeah. You see, luckily for women at that time, things that were happening in other countries were reported in local press. So demonstration of women in Philippines or Egypt or something like that would be reported as a news item. And things like that would filter through that things are happening. Now, I'd like to quote from Bikaiji Kama, who is an Indian well-known nationalist and also feminist. She went to a meeting in Egypt, or concerning Egypt, and she said, I see here the representatives of only half the population of Egypt. May I ask, where is the other half? Sons of Egypt, where are the daughters of Egypt? Where are your mothers and sisters, your wives and daughters? Now this was in 1910. And then I have another quote I'd like to just show how influence of one country might come on to many others. The Turkish secular revolution of Kemal Atatürk in 1922, where they threw out the Sultan and took power, he was against a lot of the religious practices. And the waves of modernization, secularization, social reform, which were all subdued during the Ottoman Empire of the phase. And now you get new ideas coming into Turkey. And Mustafa Kemal, the leader, he said, I see women covering their faces or turning their backs when a man approaches. Do you really think that the mothers and daughters of a civilized nation would behave so oddly or be so backward? Now these were well-known political figures who were taking up the women's issue. Now anything that Atatürk said reverberated in Egypt, in Iran, in India. People heard about anything he would say on social reform or women reform. And he at one stage even banned women wearing veils and covering up and all that from appearing in public, and said, no, taxi drivers who take such women will be fined. He was slightly, went full speed ahead with his secularization. But there was some backlash to that, because on those issues you can go so far and then you have to step back a bit. So these, and then there was a woman in Indonesia called Kartini who led a movement for women's education. And she was from a privileged family, so her influence was very strong and nobody was opposing her. In fact, she got a lot of support, and her efforts were publicized in India. So the Indians heard about Kartini, and then in Kartini would have known about what's happening in Japan and China. So there was a kind of, not an official network of feminists, but through the press, a knowledge of what was happening in the neighboring country. Now in Sri Lanka too, we had a developed press in both English and Sinhala and Tamil, which was commenting on some of these issues in various countries. So all that combined to lead women to form various groups and discussion groups. One was Dr. Mary Ratnam, a Canadian medical woman who was also a feminist, started a group, and they even had 1908, as early as that, a drama on women's rights. And it was presided over by some government official who said, "Oh, I was very impressed by your drama. Maybe you don't need a chairman like me, you need a chairwoman." No, that was a fairly advanced thing to say at the time. And such comments were being made. By 1920s, the Ceylon National Congress which was formed in 1920, and Arunachalam was the first president, a resolution was passed for limited franchise rights for women. And there was a bit of debate and stir. Arunachalam's brother Ramanathan was the one who was leading the backlash, saying we can't give women the vote, the family will collapse, the home will collapse, the country will go to the dogs. And it's casting pearl before swine, his famous utterance. The women picked this up and said, yes, good thing you said that. Now we know the real thinking by these chauvinist men. And they formed the Women's Franchise Union, which was to ask for franchise. They too didn't want to go too quickly, they asked for limited franchise. The Women's Franchise Union started in 1927, was composed of fairly prominent women from all the communities, including resident European, Burghers, Sinhalese, Tamil, Muslim, everybody was there. And they wanted to show that it was a respectable organization, because there are a lot of attacks in the paper saying that this is a very dangerous move and who are these women and so forth. They had S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike's mother, Lady Daisy, she was known as Daisy Dias Bandaranaike, as the president. And they put her forward as the voice of respectability. Now that worked only for some time, because the others tended to take over, and by the time the Donamo Commission came to Sri Lanka and took evidence from 1927 onwards, this issue became topical, because the Donamo Commission had come with the mandate of giving universal suffrage to everybody over 21, men and women. So what happened was, unofficially, one of the leaders of the Women's Franchise Union was Agnes de Silva. She was of the Burgher community, married to George de Silva, a well-known politician and lawyer from Kandy. She led a delegation to the Donamo Commission. Now he had briefed them privately, saying, ask for universal suffrage for everybody. So when she came with a delegation, he asked her, do you mean franchise for all women, including plantation women? And she said, yes, of course.